There are heroes, and then there are those whose strength lies in their quiet resilience. My son, despite his disability, was one of those heroes. Born with cerebral palsy, his body often moved differently from the other children's, his steps unsteady but determined. His wheelchair, a constant companion, was more than just a tool, it was his lifeline, the means by which he could navigate the world. But it was his spirit that made him extraordinary. Every day, he woke up with the same resolve, eager to face the world on his own terms. At school, he was known not just for his disability, but for his humor, his kindness, and his ability to connect with others in ways that transcended any limitations. His friends didn't see him as different, they saw him for who he truly was, smart, funny, and brave. He never let his condition define him, and in doing so, he taught those around him the real meaning of strength. To them, he wasn't a kid in a wheelchair, he was just their friend. The school playground was his kingdom, a place where children came together to play, laugh, and dream. It was a place filled with the sounds of running feet, the energy of youthful excitement, and the warmth of friendship. Yet, like any place where people gather, there were moments when prejudice would slip through the cracks, moments when my son would catch a look, a whispered comment, or a glance that made him feel like he didn't belong. But he never let it affect him for long. He had his friends, and that was all that mattered. They accepted him without question, and in their eyes, he was just like them. It was in these moments, surrounded by his peers, that I saw my son's true courage. He wasn't just navigating the world on wheels, he was challenging the very idea that limitations should define him. His bravery wasn't in fighting battles, it was in living each day with a smile, in proving that anyone, no matter the circumstances, could be a hero. Karen had always been known in the neighborhood. As a member of the Homeowners Association, HOA, she carried herself with an air of authority, often taking it upon herself to police the smallest of infractions. Her reputation preceded her, she was the one who always made sure the lawns were perfectly manicured, the mailboxes were pristine, and the noise levels were kept to a minimum. In many ways, Karen prided herself on maintaining order, but it wasn't just the community she sought to control, it was everyone around her. The slightest deviation from what she deemed proper would send her into a frenzy. People whispered about her in hushed tones, recounting her unsolicited advice, her sharp judgments, and her unrelenting gaze that seemed to dissect people as if they were mere objects to be scrutinized. It was a warm afternoon when Karen strolled into the school playground, her eyes scanning the area with the precision of a hawk. The laughter of children, the sound of bouncing balls, and the hum of excitement filled the air, but Karen's attention was elsewhere. She had a mission, to ensure that everything was running as it should, that no one was out of line. It wasn't long before her gaze landed on my son. There he was, in his wheelchair, surrounded by his friends, smiling as they played together. To anyone else, it was just another ordinary scene, a group of children, enjoying their time on the playground. But to Karen, there was something unsettling about it. At first, she lingered at the edge of the playground, her eyes narrowing as she watched my son. His wheelchair seemed to be a symbol of something she couldn't quite place. Was he really just another child, or was there something more? She watched him for a while, her lips pressed in a tight line, before slowly making her way towards him. As she approached, her eyes never left him. Karen's steps were measured, almost deliberate, as if she were trying to catch him in the act of something. Her mind began to race with suspicion. What could he possibly be hiding in that wheelchair? Could it be something dangerous? She didn't know why, but something about the sight of my son, so carefree, so happy, seemed to unsettle her. It didn't make sense. But that didn't matter, Karen had already begun to judge, and in her mind, there was no room for doubt. Her gaze followed him, calculating, dissecting every movement. And with each passing second, the tension in the air thickened. Karen's footsteps echoed on the asphalt as she approached my son, her eyes fixed on him like a hawk locking onto its prey. The playful sounds of children's laughter and games seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the cold, tense air that hung between them. My son, oblivious to the storm that was brewing, looked up and smiled at her. His face, as always, was filled with warmth and curiosity, but Karen's eyes showed no trace of kindness, only suspicion and judgment. "Is there something you're hiding?" she asked, her voice sharp, the words cutting through the air like a blade. My son froze. He looked up at her, confusion written all over his face. "Hiding something?" he echoed, his voice small, almost unsure. Karen didn't wait for an answer. She leaned in slightly, peering into his lap as though she expected to find something hidden under the blanket that draped over his legs. Her eyes scanned every inch of him, her expression tense, almost as if she had already made up her mind about what she'd find. But there was nothing. No hidden weapons, no bags of stolen goods, just a young boy in a wheelchair, enjoying a peaceful afternoon like any other child. "You're not fooling me," she continued, her voice growing more hostile. "I know what you're up to. You think I can't see it, but I can. You're hiding something dangerous, aren't you?" Her words were laced with the kind of certainty that could only come from an overactive imagination, a mind already twisted by its own fears and assumptions. My son's face turned pale, his heart racing in his chest. "I'm not hiding anything," he said, his voice trembling now. "I'm just playing with my friends." But Karen wasn't listening. She shook her head dismissively, as if his words meant nothing. "Don't lie to me. I've seen kids like you before. Always hiding something, always up to no good." Her words were venomous, and they struck deep into my son's heart. He had never been treated like this before, not in all his years of school. He had always been just another kid, his disability no barrier to the friendships and bonds he had formed. But here, in this moment, he was nothing more than an object of suspicion. Her gaze flicked back to his wheelchair, her lips curled into a thin, judgmental line. "What are you hiding in there?" she demanded, leaning even closer, her breath now warm against his face. "I'm not hiding anything," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Tears welled in his eyes, not from physical pain, but from the hurt of being accused of something he hadn't done. He wanted to look away, to retreat, but the wheelchair held him in place, trapped in Karen's unwavering stare. Karen's anger flared. "You think I'm stupid?" she snapped. "You're just like all the others. I knew I couldn't trust you." The words stung, each one landing like a blow. My son, too confused and frightened to respond, simply sat there, unable to understand why Karen, someone he barely knew, had suddenly turned so cruel. But Karen wasn't finished yet. She was convinced of her own narrative, and no amount of reasoning would change that. "Stay away from me," she hissed, her finger pointing accusingly at him. "You're nothing but trouble." The tension in the air was suffocating, and as Karen turned her back to him, my son sat there, broken in a way no child should ever have to be. The accusation had cut through him, not just physically, but emotionally. He wasn't sure if he would ever feel safe again. Karen's eyes narrowed, her face growing more flushed with each passing second. The coldness in her gaze was chilling, as though she could no longer separate her growing suspicion from the reality of the situation. It wasn't just about the wheelchair anymore. Karen had built a narrative in her mind, one where my son was the villain. The boy in the wheelchair wasn't just a child with cerebral palsy anymore, he was a danger, a threat that had to be confronted. Her eyes locked onto him, more intense than ever, as she took another step closer. "You think you can hide from me, don't you? But I see you for what you really are," she muttered, more to herself than to him, as though the accusation had become a mantra. She was losing touch with the reality of the situation, her mind racing with unfounded fears and paranoid thoughts. "I know what you're hiding in there. This isn't just some innocent game. This is serious. You're dangerous." Her words cut deep, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. My son, trembling in his wheelchair, stared up at her in confusion and fear. His hands gripped the wheels tightly, but they offered him no comfort. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He wanted to explain, to tell her that there was nothing hidden, that he wasn't what she believed him to be, but he couldn't. The words wouldn't form, not with the fear tightening in his chest. "I'm not hiding anything," he whispered again, his voice quivering, barely audible in the tense silence between them. "Please, just let me go." But Karen wasn't listening anymore. Her eyes, wide with a strange, manic focus, began scanning his wheelchair, as though she were searching for the dangerous object she imagined was hidden there. It was clear she had become unhinged, her actions no longer grounded in reason. She wasn't just looking for the truth, she had already decided what it was. "Enough of this," she snapped, her voice sharp as she reached down to her side. My son's eyes widened as he noticed the glint of something metallic in her hand. It was too late to stop it. Karen pulled a gun from her jacket, a small, compact weapon that she had concealed without anyone noticing, and, without warning, pointed it directly at my son. Everything seemed to slow down. The air felt heavy, suffocating. Time itself seemed to hesitate as Karen's finger tightened on the trigger. In that moment, there was no more room for words, for reason, or for explanation. It was just the raw, horrifying reality of a mother's worst nightmare unfolding before my eyes. The world went still, and the next thing I heard was the deafening sound of a gunshot. The impact was immediate. My son's body jerked as the bullet struck him, the force of the shot throwing him back in his wheelchair. A scream rang out from the children nearby, the noise now sharp and filled with panic. Karen stood there, frozen, staring at the gun in her hand as if she couldn't quite believe what she had just done. For a moment, she was motionless, her eyes wide, her chest heaving with each breath. It was as though she had crossed a line from which there was no return, and in that split second, the consequences of her actions began to sink in. The playground erupted into chaos. Teachers screamed, rushing toward my son as others scrambled to dial for help. Children scattered in all directions, some crying, others frozen in fear. The scene quickly descended into utter confusion, but amidst the frenzy, one thing remained painfully clear: the unthinkable had just happened. My son, pale and gasping for breath, slumped in his wheelchair, his hand pressed to his chest as blood began to stain his shirt. The color drained from his face, but there was a light in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, of fear, but also of confusion. His friends, terrified and helpless, knelt around him, trying to comfort him, but the sight of the blood, the reality of the situation, overwhelmed them. Karen stood motionless at the center of it all, the gun still in her hand, but no longer raised. Her mouth opened and closed, as if trying to speak, but no words came out. She seemed trapped in a storm of her own making, the horror of her actions too much to comprehend. The teachers rushed to my son's side, applying pressure to his wound, but the panic was evident in their actions. They were trained to handle emergencies, but nothing could prepare them for this. The minutes that followed felt like hours, time stretched thin and excruciating. Some ran for help, others called the authorities, but the playground had transformed from a place of innocent joy to a chaotic scene of emergency. Children sobbed, some crouching behind the nearest trees, others huddled together in fear. The laughter that had filled the air moments ago was now replaced with the sharpness of distress and the cries for help that seemed to echo far too loudly. And all the while, Karen stood at the center, her grip on the gun loosening, her expression distant, as though she had no idea what had just transpired. What she had done. The moment the gunshot rang out, the playground descended into pure chaos. Time seemed to splinter as the noise and confusion overwhelmed every corner of the space. Teachers rushed forward, their faces pale with fear, shouting orders, trying to clear the crowd of children. Some were frozen in place, their eyes wide, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Others screamed, running in all directions, seeking shelter, unsure of what else might unfold. The playground, once a place of laughter and joy, was now an arena of panic. My son, slumped in his wheelchair, was surrounded by a circle of terrified children, their faces painted with horror. His friends knelt by his side, their hands trembling as they tried to offer comfort, not knowing what to do or how to help. Blood soaked through his shirt, staining the fabric a deep red, as he struggled to take shallow breaths. His hand pressed tightly to his chest, but no matter how hard he tried to stop the bleeding, it wouldn't subside. "Someone call 911, a teacher screamed, her voice panicked as she knelt next to my son, trying to apply pressure to the wound. The sound of her voice cut through the air, but it only added to the disarray. Children were crying, some clutching each other, others screaming for their parents. The once orderly scene had become a living nightmare, with no clear path forward. A teacher, her hands shaking, pulled out her phone, dialing frantically. But even as she tried to call for help, her hands trembled, unable to maintain any kind of steady grip. It was as though the weight of the situation had taken hold of everyone at once. How could something like this happen? The question echoed through the minds of everyone present, parents, teachers, and children alike. How could Karen, of all people, have done this? Meanwhile, Karen stood a few feet away, her gaze fixed on the ground, her body rigid. She hadn't moved since the shot was fired, as if she were paralyzed by the gravity of her actions. The gun in her hand dangled loosely at her side, a haunting reminder of the violence that had just unfolded. The teachers and children had created a barrier around my son, but Karen stood on the outskirts, silent, watching as the world around her spun out of control. "Karen, what did you do?" one of the teachers shouted, her voice breaking with disbelief. "What is wrong with you? You shot him." Karen didn't answer at first. She just stood there, her body stiff, her eyes vacant. Then, slowly, as though she were waking from a trance, she turned to face the teacher, her expression empty. "I didn't mean to," she said, her voice hollow. I was just protecting myself. He was hiding something. I thought he was dangerous." Her words, though, did nothing to ease the terror that had spread like wildfire across the playground. The teachers exchanged glances, their faces a mix of shock and anger. No one seemed to believe her. No one could. There was nothing in my son's actions that warranted such a response. He hadn't done anything wrong. The only thing he had hidden was his vulnerability, and even that was no justification for what had happened. "I was afraid," Karen continued, her voice shaking now. "I thought he had a weapon in his wheelchair. He wouldn't answer me. He wouldn't tell me what he was hiding. I thought he was going to hurt me." Her words tumbled out, erratic and disjointed, as though she were trying to convince herself of something that wasn't true. "I had no choice. I was scared. I thought I was in danger." But her defense only made it worse. It didn't add up. The more Karen spoke, the more it became clear that her fear wasn't based on reality, it was born out of something deeper, something darker. Prejudice, fear of the unknown, and a refusal to see the humanity in others had clouded her judgment. There was no weapon. There was no threat. There was just a boy in a wheelchair, caught in the crossfire of her own irrational fears. My son didn't have anything. He was just sitting there, trying to play with his friends, the teacher shouted, her voice rising with frustration. "You shot him for no reason." Karen flinched at the words, her face crumpling as the weight of her actions began to sink in. But it was too late. There was no going back from this. The sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second, signaling the arrival of help. But for everyone standing there, the damage had already been done. The playground, once a safe space, had been irrevocably shattered. The moment the gunshot rang out, everything had changed. The questions of why and how would linger long after the sirens faded. Would Karen be held accountable for her actions? Would my son survive this? But right now, all that mattered was getting him the help he so desperately needed. As the teachers and children continued to surround him, holding him, protecting him, Karen stood silently off to the side, her defense sounding more hollow with every passing moment. The world outside blurred into a series of flashing lights and muffled voices as the paramedics rushed my son to the ambulance. His body, pale and trembling, lay on the stretcher as the team worked quickly, their hands moving with precision, trying to stabilize him. I could hear the faint beeping of machines, the sound of the oxygen mask against his face, but everything felt distant, as if I were trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I ran behind the stretcher, my heart hammering in my chest. Every step I took felt like it was taking me further from reality, further from the boy I had known so well. The boy who had once been so full of life, whose laugh could light up a room. And now here he was, fighting for his life, all because of a misunderstanding, a moment of cruelty that had shattered everything in its path. As the doors of the ambulance slammed shut, I climbed in beside him, trying to steady myself as the vehicle raced through the streets. The flashing lights outside lit up his face, casting eerie shadows across his pale skin. His chest rose and fell with shallow, labored breaths, each one a struggle. His hand, still pressed tightly against the wound, was now stained with his own blood. I reached out, brushing his hair from his forehead, hoping to comfort him, but I could see the pain in his eyes. His body was in shock, but it was his mind that was working overtime, processing everything at once. Inside his fragile mind, a battle raged on. He had always been strong, never letting his disability define him, but now, as he lay there in agony, struggling for every breath, there was nothing he could do. His fight for survival wasn't just physical, it was emotional, a battle against the fear, the pain, and the overwhelming sense of helplessness that threatened to consume him. Why did this happen to me? He thought, his mind racing with confusion. Why did she think I was dangerous? He could feel the weight of the accusation pressing down on him, even now, even as his body lay broken and bruised. The pain in his chest was unbearable, but it wasn't just the physical wound that tore at him, it was the emotional one. He had always been taught to trust others, to believe that people would see him for who he truly was. But Karen had shattered that belief with one shot. His thoughts wandered back to the playground. The laughter, the games, his friends. Everything had been so normal, so safe, until Karen's cold stare had changed everything. He could still hear her voice, accusing him of something he hadn't done. I wasn't hiding anything. I wasn't doing anything wrong. But she hadn't cared. The world she had created in her mind had no place for the truth. Despite the chaos in his mind, my son fought to hold on to something. He had always been strong, but now he needed to be stronger than ever. The voices around him, the paramedics, the distant sounds of the world outside, faded into the background as his body began to shut down from the shock. His thoughts grew hazy, his grip on reality slipping away. Please, just let me stay awake, he thought, struggling to hold on to consciousness, to fight against the darkness that was closing in on him. As the ambulance sped toward the hospital, the battle for his life waged on. His pulse was weak, his body fragile, but his spirit, his fight to live, was unyielding. Every breath was a victory, even as the odds stacked against him seemed impossible. The pain, the fear, the uncertainty, it all blurred into one overwhelming sensation. But somewhere, deep within, he clung to hope. He couldn't give up. He wouldn't give up. And as I sat there, holding his hand, whispering words of comfort, I realized that this wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for dignity, for understanding, for the chance to prove that he was not the villain Karen had painted him to be. This was not the end. Not for him. Not for us. We would fight through this, together. The ambulance screeched to a halt outside the hospital, and I was pulled from my thoughts. The doors flew open, and a team of doctors and nurses rushed in. They began to work on my son immediately, their movements swift and practiced, but my heart remained lodged in my throat. I watched them struggle to stabilize him, their faces grim, knowing that the battle was far from over. The hospital lights were too bright, too sterile. But amidst the chaos, I clung to the one thing I knew for sure: my son was a fighter. And no matter how this turned out, we would face it together. The news of the shooting spread like wildfire, carried by every social media platform, every local news outlet. Within hours, the tragedy became the talk of the town, then the state, and soon, the entire nation. Headlines flashed across screens, but the story that the media portrayed was far from the truth. The narrative began to take on a life of its own, manipulated by public opinion, distorted by speculation, and shaped by those who wanted to see it one way or another. At first, the headlines were shocking: schoolyard tragedy, disabled child shot by HOA member, but as the story progressed, the details began to morph. Some outlets painted Karen as a victim of fear, describing her as a woman simply trying to protect herself from an unknown danger. Headlines like "Self-defense gone wrong" made it sound as though she had acted out of sheer terror, overwhelmed by the sight of a child in a wheelchair. They called it a tragic misunderstanding, and suddenly, Karen was a woman who had acted in the heat of the moment, with little thought about the life she had taken. But the true story, the one that no one wanted to hear, was buried under layers of spin. They ignored the fact that Karen had approached my son with suspicion, without cause, her assumptions clouded by fear and prejudice. She hadn't seen a child in need of protection, she had seen a threat. That was the truth that the media didn't want to acknowledge. As the debate raged on, so did the ripple effect through the community. People started to pick sides. Some voiced support for Karen, claiming that she was simply defending herself. She didn't know what was going on. The boy in the wheelchair could have been hiding something, they said. To them, Karen was just an ordinary person caught in an extraordinary situation, someone who had panicked, perhaps, but was ultimately innocent. They downplayed the gravity of her actions, explaining them away with words like fear, misunderstanding, and self-defense. On the other side, there was outrage. The community rallied around my son, demanding justice for what had happened. There was no reason for her to pull the trigger, they said. This wasn't fear. This was an unjustified attack on an innocent child. The anger grew as more people came forward with their own stories, stories of their own encounters with Karen, each recounting her tendency to judge, her history of assuming the worst in people. They didn't want to see her as a victim, they saw her as someone who had crossed a line, and they were unwilling to let her actions go unchallenged. The more the community divided, the more heated the debate became. People argued in schools, in town halls, and in the streets. Some said that Karen should face severe punishment for her actions, that her fear was no excuse for what she had done. Others insisted that she was just another victim of the world's complexities, trapped in her own biases, and that her actions, while tragic, were born from her own fears. It became a fight about what constituted self-defense, about who deserved to feel safe, and about the responsibility we all have to look beyond our assumptions. At the heart of it all, my son lay in a hospital bed, fighting to survive, caught in the middle of a battle that was not of his making. The fallout from that single moment, that single shot, reverberated through every corner of our lives. It wasn't just a tragedy, it had become a battleground, one where truth, justice, and fear collided. And no matter how the community chose to spin the story, there was only one reality that mattered: my son was still fighting to live, and the truth of what happened on that playground could never be twisted. The courtroom was filled with tension, an electric air that seemed to vibrate with every passing second. The family sat in the front row, my heart pounding in my chest, as I watched Karen enter. She walked slowly, her face pale, her eyes avoiding the gaze of those around her. The gravity of the situation was evident, yet she seemed numb, as though she hadn't fully grasped the consequences of her actions. Her lawyer, a sharp-dressed man with a practiced smile, led her to the defense table, where she sat down with a stiff posture, her hands folded in her lap. Across the room, my son sat quietly beside me. His bandages were still fresh, his body weakened from the wounds that had nearly taken his life. But it was his spirit that had been broken most of all. His eyes were distant, hollow, as though he was still trying to come to terms with the betrayal he had felt. The family's need for justice hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. We weren't just seeking accountability for the shooting, we were seeking the truth. The truth that Karen had been blinded by her own prejudices and fears, the truth that my son had been an innocent victim of an irrational judgment. The trial had already been going on for several days, but today, the air felt different. Today, Karen would take the stand. Her lawyer called her up, and the entire courtroom fell silent. She walked to the witness stand slowly, her heels clicking on the wooden floor with each step. As she sat down, the room seemed to lean in, the weight of her testimony looming over everything. She looked out over the audience, her gaze lingering for a moment on the family, but it was clear she wasn't seeing us. She was seeing something else, the distorted version of reality she had created for herself. "I didn't know what was happening," Karen began, her voice shaky but resolute. "I was scared. I saw him in that wheelchair, and I couldn't see what he was doing. I thought he was hiding something. I thought he was going to hurt me." Her words were cold, laced with the fear she had built up in her own mind. "I asked him what he was hiding, and when he didn't answer me, I thought he was going to attack. I thought he was dangerous." There was a quiet murmur in the courtroom. I could feel the rage building inside me, but I stayed silent, listening, waiting. This was her defense, her explanation for what she had done. She continued, her voice cracking under the weight of the words. "I was just trying to protect myself. I was afraid. I've been in situations before where I've felt threatened, and in that moment, all I could think about was protecting myself." My son's breath hitched beside me, and I placed my hand on his, trying to give him some comfort, though I knew nothing could take away the pain he was feeling. Karen's defense, her attempt to justify her actions with fear, made my blood boil. There had been no threat. There had been no reason to pull that gun. Yet, here she was, standing in front of us, trying to shift the blame to her own irrational fears. The prosecution stood up next, and the courtroom held its breath as they questioned Karen further. "You say you were afraid, but did you ever consider the possibility that the boy you shot, the boy you accused of hiding something, was simply a child in a wheelchair, trying to play with his friends?" the prosecutor asked. Karen stammered, her confidence cracking under the pressure. I didn't know what he was doing. I couldn't see him properly. All I saw was someone who wouldn't answer me. And I reacted." The prosecutor didn't let up. "But isn't it true that you assumed the worst about him? Isn't it true that you made a snap judgment based on your own prejudice, not on any real threat?" Karen's silence was deafening. Her lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Karen herself seemed to shrink, her eyes darting around the courtroom as though seeking an escape. The truth had begun to chip away at the false narrative she had woven for herself. As the trial wore on, the emotional toll on my family became apparent. My son, once full of life, now sat silently, his hands clenched in his lap. The trauma of the shooting, of seeing his life reduced to nothing more than a moment of fear in someone else's mind, weighed heavily on him. For him, this trial wasn't just about seeking justice, it was about reclaiming his own dignity, his own right to be seen as a human being, not a threat. When it was our turn to speak, my voice trembled as I addressed the court. "My son didn't deserve this," I said, my words breaking through the silence. "He didn't deserve to be treated like a criminal simply because he was different. He didn't deserve to be shot, to have his life taken from him because someone decided to fear him." And then, finally, the resolution came. After hours of testimony, after all the words had been spoken, the jury deliberated. It didn't take long for them to return with their verdict. Guilty. The room went quiet as the judge called the decision. Karen's defense crumbled, her fear-based justification no longer enough to protect her from the consequences of her actions. She was held accountable, not just for the physical harm she caused my son, but for the emotional trauma she had inflicted on all of us. The verdict was a small victory, a long-awaited moment of justice. But for my son, the road to healing would be long. The trial may have concluded, but the scars, both visible and invisible, would take far longer to heal. The fight wasn't over, it had only just begun. The days that followed the trial felt surreal, as though the world had shifted beneath our feet. My son was no longer the same boy who had entered that playground weeks ago, full of laughter and joy. He was a survivor now, a fighter, not just for his life, but for his identity. The physical wounds were healing, but the emotional scars would take much longer to mend. He spent weeks in the hospital, the sterile white walls a constant reminder of what he had endured. At first, he seemed distant, his eyes hollow as though the weight of what had happened had taken something from him that he couldn't get back. He was quiet, withdrawn, and reluctant to speak about the shooting, about the pain, about anything. The doctors assured us that his recovery was going well, but it wasn't just his body that needed time to heal, it was his heart, his sense of safety, his trust in the world around him. As the days stretched on, I watched my son slowly start to rebuild. It wasn't easy. There were nights when he would wake up in a cold sweat, the images of that moment replaying in his mind. There were moments when he would shrink from people's gazes, as though he couldn't bear to be seen, to be judged, to be feared. It was as though every person who looked at him saw something that wasn't truly there, a threat that had never existed. But through it all, something incredible happened. Slowly, bit by bit, he began to find himself again. He started to draw closer to the friends who had stuck by him, offering their support even when they didn't fully understand the depth of what he had gone through. They had never judged him for being different, and their unwavering belief in him became his anchor. Together, they spent hours playing games, talking, laughing. Slowly, my son began to remember what it felt like to be a child again, to be free from fear, even if only for a moment. He started attending therapy, both physical and emotional, to work through the pain and trauma. The road was long, and at times, it felt like 2 steps forward and 1 step back. There were setbacks, of course, days when the weight of what had happened felt too heavy to carry. But each day, he made progress. He learned to speak about his feelings, to confront the fear that had taken root deep inside of him. Slowly, he started trusting again, not just the world around him, but himself. I often watched him in quiet moments, as he sat by the window, looking out at the world with a new understanding. He had seen the darker side of humanity, the fear, the prejudice, the irrationality that could change someone's life in an instant. But he had also seen the power of resilience, of community, of the people who stood by him and fought with him when he couldn't fight for himself. The love and support that surrounded him became his strength, and he grew into someone even stronger than before. One afternoon, as we sat together in the park, the same park where he had once played carefree, I looked over at my son and saw something that I hadn't seen in weeks, a smile. It was small at first, but it was there, a glimmer of the boy he had been before the tragedy. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a quiet strength, and for the first time in a long while, I knew he would be okay. Not because everything had been fixed, but because he had found his way back to himself. As we walked home that day, I realized that this ordeal had taught us both something invaluable. Fear and prejudice had nearly taken my son's life, but they had also sparked something greater, his ability to rise above, to heal, and to find his voice again. The world would always have its flaws, its injustices, its moments of darkness, but the light that comes from within, from the people who care and the strength we find in each other, would always be stronger. Moving forward wasn't about forgetting the past, it was about embracing it, learning from it, and finding the courage to continue, even in the face of adversity. And for my son, that was the greatest victory of all. As I sit here, reflecting on everything that has happened, it's hard to put into words the depth of this journey. We've been through a nightmare, a tragedy that no parent should ever have to endure. But through it all, one thing remains clear: my son's strength has been a beacon of hope, not just for our family, but for everyone who has stood by us. This experience has reshaped us in ways we never expected. It's reminded us that the world isn't always fair, and that fear and prejudice can change lives in an instant, but it's also taught us the immense power of resilience, of love, and of community. We've seen how quickly assumptions can spiral into actions that have devastating consequences. But we've also witnessed the healing power of compassion, the importance of speaking out, and the value of standing together when the world feels like it's crumbling. As a family, we've grown stronger, our bond unbreakable in the face of such adversity. This journey isn't over. My son's recovery, both physically and emotionally, is ongoing. But what this tragedy has taught us is that no matter how dark the world may seem, there is always light to be found. And no matter how much fear someone else tries to impose on us, the power of understanding, empathy, and love will always prevail.